My family's Irish heritage was made clear to me while I grew up. Almost everyone on my family tree came to America from Ireland during one diaspora or another. But decades passed before I made any effort to learn anything about my Irish ancestry and this small home country. Even then, my study was limited to reading books on Irish history I could find on the shelves of the Ipswich Public Library, where I come from. I had no intention of taking a deep dive into Irish history. All that changed when my children gave me and my husband to my first trip to Ireland. I had long known that there were diaries somewhere that had information about my Harshaw family. I planned to find them on the trip. However, they weren't in Ireland. I learned that when my phone rang one Friday afternoon. There was an unfamiliar voice on the other end. Karen Hickey identified herself as a cousin who had reached out to me as a result of an outreach I had made to find information about the diaries. Karen lived in Keokuk, Iowa. Then she uttered the life-changing words, "I have the Harshaw diaries." I can guarantee you I would never have looked for them in Keokuk, Iowa. At that moment, I started down the path that led to wonderful adventures, great challenges, and the two unique Irish histories I'm here to introduce to you today. I feel a bit guilty that my name is on the covers of these books, for to be truthful, I didn't actually write many of the words contained in them. These histories were principally written by three ordinary Irishmen who lived through much of the 19th century, men you have certainly never heard of. I was more detective, editor, assembler, and context creator than author. The three writers lived in the 19th century. They were alive 200 years ago, so they're not around to do the promotion of their work. Both Dwelling Place of Dragons and Dueling Dragons record Irish history as it happened, and amazing and important events occurred during the 45 years of history that unfold in its pages. The tithe wars, the poor laws, the struggle for tenants' rights and education for all children, voting rights, tariffs and free trade, excessive Irish taxation. These are topics that are not unfamiliar to us today. Government endorsement of a single religion, potential revolutions to wrest control of Ireland from England and to bring democracy to this beautiful island. Most horrible of all, Ireland was reduced to ruin during the 7 years of the Great Famine. Not long after I returned from my trip, Karen sent me the diaries. As it turned out, there were 6 large volumes. Large books bound in red and filled with the accounts of the life of an ordinary Irish farmer. They were written by James Harshaw, a man without a great education and little sense of grammar or spelling. Hard for an English teacher. However, through the information scrawled on the sheets of ledger paper, I learned that James was a good man, generous to the laborers who worked his leased farms, loving father to a large family, and an honorable public citizen. On most days, James would write 3 or 4 lines, not unlike people who keep diaries today. For example, on April 1st, 1846, James wrote a typical entry. Another fine day. Alexander Douglas sent me 6 cubic weight of seed oats that he had gotten from Blakely of Ballyroney. Sowed of it for the first this season on the upper brae and the near side of the 4th field. Shower in the evening. Visited Mrs. McCullough. Later entries provided explanations for the unfamiliar names and customs presented in this one entry. It turned out that Alexander Douglas married James's daughter Mary. Ballyroney was a townland not far away. Upper Bray and Forthfield were two of the names James had given each of the towns, each of the fields he leased. 13 days later, James wrote an entry that explained the visit to Mrs. McCullough. April 14, a dark morning. Mr. John McCullough died about 7:30 this morning. Was sent for by Mrs. McCullough. I arrived there a few minutes after his death. Found the missus and children in tears. Went with Joe Carswell to Newry to prepare for his funeral. Returned about 5 o'clock and had an interview with Mr. Johnson in John Martin's. Rain. When I brought the diaries home again to Ireland, 100 years after they arrived in America, I donated them to the Public Record Office in Belfast, where I knew they would be properly preserved. Historians there told me that I had uncovered an Irish treasure. Nothing like these documents, painstakingly recorded over many years, existed. Once the diaries were safe at home in Ireland, I had a choice. I could move on with my original plans to write about Ipswich history, or plunge deep into a study of Irish history. I decided, wisely as it turned out, to choose the latter path forward. In the second entry above, James mentioned John Martin, a man I had never heard of before. Has anybody ever heard of John Martin? In none of the talks I have given has anyone ever heard of John Martin. But you'll see he was quite a famous person. In other volumes, James made clear that John Martin was his nephew, and that somehow John was an important political leader. However, his name seldom appeared in any Irish history I had read. I could think of only one other possible source for additional information about this newly discovered cousin of mine. Newspapers were the only media of the day. Perhaps there might be a local newspaper that would fill the deep gulfs in my knowledge about John and clarify my understanding of Irish life in the 19th century, which is pretty non-existent. Luckily for me, just such a newspaper existed, the Newry Commercial Telegraph. Even better, many years of the paper had been filmed by the National Library in London, and they were for sale. I bought myself a second-hand microfilm reader, which I set up next to my computer. One by one, I ordered rolls of film, which then arrived in my mailbox in Ipswich. Hour upon hour, I sat in my office and read these ancient newspapers and typed notes into files on my computer. When I finished, I had read each edition of the newspaper, beginning with the earliest year available in 1828 and ending with 1875. 7,332 editions of the newspaper in all. I had learned a lot about the history of Ireland generally, and the area around Newry in particular. This ancient town was located at the end of Carlingford Lough, which led directly to the Irish Sea. It was also situated on the main road between Dublin and Belfast. As a result of its location, it had experienced many invasions, first by Viking pillagers, later by a part of Oliver Cromwell's army, and finally by King William's forces marching south to the Battle of the Boyne. John Martin appeared often in the columns of the newspaper and other publications as well. Though forgotten today, he was well known during his lifetime, and he left an extensive written record. John kept a journal himself during some periods of his life, fragments of which still exist. But mainly he wrote letters and speeches which recorded his political actions and beliefs. He based his life as an Irish political leader on 4 guiding principles. He began each political encounter with the understanding that his ideas might be wrong. Therefore, he had to listen carefully and respectfully to those with expressing opposing beliefs. Political progress depended on compromising these opposing positions. Finally, he believed it was wrong to profit from public service. He was a much more educated man than his uncle Harshaw, having graduated from Trinity College. Still, his purpose in life was to be a farmer, to manage the townland of Lahorn, which his family actually owned. Most Irish men did not own any property. John and James often worked together, the Martin family being located just across the lane from the Harshaw lands, both 4 miles north of Newry town. John was never a healthy man, having suffered from severe asthma from the time he was a baby, but he pushed through attacks as best he could and resumed work as soon as the symptoms eased. Through some sort of a miracle, I had accidentally stumbled onto 2 connected men who wrote extensive first-hand accounts of their personal histories, a gold mine of unknown information. Somehow, I had to make this information available to those who care about Ireland today. Publishing an Irish history based on the writings of these 2 men seemed the best option. There remained a major problem to overcome. These first 2 of my writers didn't provide a balanced history, as the important voices of Protestant loyalists of Ireland remained silent. These loyalists strongly supported the Act of Union passed in 1801, which allowed England to control Ireland. To write a complete history of this time period, I needed yet another writer to provide this alternative perspective. I realized that finding a third unknown writer to fill the void would require another miracle. And that miracle happened as well. I knew that the editor of the Newry Telegraph was George Henderson, a young man, also a Presbyterian, who recorded his strong views supporting the Act of Union and British domination of Ireland in editorials, which appeared in each edition of the paper. I had come to know him well through reading decades of his editorials. He was a very partisan supporter of the Conservative Party. But on several occasions, he wrote a sentence that seemed to result from a moment of epiphany. One example was published in 1843. It is the curse of party, by which he means political party, that it sees no light in an opponent or shadow in an ally. It blinds the understanding and dechristianizes the heart. I actually read that line as the first plane hit the first tower on 9/11. Spooky. When I discovered that this editor, George Henderson, actually knew both John and James, I realized I had found my third writer. Now that I've given you a general introduction to the books and how they came to exist, I'm going to turn to one of the many topics within them and detail how it was covered by these Irish writers. Today, I'm going to discuss a surprising topic: Irish views on our Civil War. James Harshaw had only one entry on the subject: September 23, 1862, a dry, gray day with a gale from the east. This day's Banner, which is a Presbyterian newspaper, reports the American federal cause to be declining. At this time, he was preoccupied with a conflict within his own church, intense financial problems, and failing health. But our war was intensely interesting to both John and George, but for very different reasons. Both men had attended Dr. Henderson's classical school in Newry. Another student, John Mitchell. Anybody heard of John Mitchell? He was another famous Irishman. John Mitchell became John's lifelong friend. John didn't marry until late in life, so he considered Mitchell's children, 3 sons and 3 daughters, to be satisfactory substitutes for the children he never had. Mitchell had moved to America and become an ardent supporter of slavery and the Confederacy. His sons, John, James, and Willie, all joined the Confederate Army. So John's great worry about the war was strongly personal. He would follow the war news through the extensive coverage in George's newspaper. I'm sure it's a surprise. Who would think that the Irish were interested in our Civil War? But they were. George had a very different motivation for his interest and his thorough reporting throughout the entire conflict. He had long worried that civil war would break out in Ireland. Certainly, the Protestant population would never agree to the Irish independence, so desired by a large majority of the Irish population. Rather than meekly submit to any change in the relations between Ireland and England, they would immediately resort to rebellion. Fighting in Ireland would not be fighting against geographic sections. Civil war in Ireland would be highly personal war of neighbor against neighbor. And I'm sure you all know what's happened in the recent years there. George had anticipated that the war was about to break out in America for several years. But not only was America polluted by the institution of slavery, but their republican form of government was far inferior to the English monarchy. He conceded that republican governance allowed greater freedom with a negative impact as well. He viewed republicanism as the very form of government under which the ruffian is licensed to enjoy himself. It's always odd to hear your country criticized by people from overseas. To illustrate how easy it was to unleash ungoverned mobs, George reprinted a circular from the South. The circular urged the Irish living in the North to commit themselves to a campaign of arson against abolitionists in places like New York and Boston. If arsonists needed to escape capture, the people of the South would help with money and sanctuary. This plot hit home for George, as an editorial made clear. Such a system of terrorism and secret criminality as is recommended must necessarily shatter and overturn the very fabric of society. The ribbonism in our own country, with its silent and murderous ravages, would be more than matched in the desperate wickedness by the dastardly yet deadly plotting of America's slaveholders. Though not a call to war, this scheme made clear the depths of rupture between the states promoting the extension of slavery and those fighting to prevent it. George believed that America couldn't long continue under the strain of these two different beliefs. He predicted that oppression would soon lose out to freedom, but he did have some reservations. True it is that John Mitchell, the ranting patriot and licentious and loud-tongued freeman when in this land, became in America the bitterest foe of the downtrodden slaves and the coarse and blustering apologist of the deeds of the cruel dealers in human flesh and blood. Certainly, the Irish in America wouldn't follow Mitchell's plan, but then George quoted another Irish immigrant who seemed to echo Mitchell's beliefs. We white men, as a nation, made our laws, vesting political rights in the white American people. We left the Negro in the condition of a bondsman. To that condition, the Negro is assigned by nature. That nature gave him a master to coerce his will, and that will make him a useful and valuable servant, capable of living for himself and for the master who governs him. As 1861 began, George returned to the threatening situation in America. He warned his readers that America was disintegrating. Old empires have no disease worse than slavery, which the United States inherited from Europe and Asia. There is a bitterness in every human cup, and the United States, with all its juvenile vigor and hopefulness, has to taste of it, as well as other kingdoms and empires that have gone before them. The events of 1860 have given the Federation a severer shock than it has ever yet experienced, and proved, even to Americans themselves, that republics governed by the will of the people are just as likely to go wrong as monarchies and despotisms. George frequently quoted opinions from other papers that interested him. One such editorial in The Irishman explained that the connection between Ireland and America went far beyond commercial interests, and why the Irish were so fixated on war in another country. Particularly in Ireland, the subject bears great interest, for we are bound up to the American people by many a tie of memory and affection. So long ago as their days of struggle, and he means the Revolution, her interest was linked to their destiny and their hopes, and it has become intensified in the years that have gone by since. The hand of Ireland was there. Lifted in stern assertion of American rights, the blood of Ireland was poured forth for their maintenance, and crimsoned every battlefield with its tide of love. Is it not her children who have gone into the forest, into the wilderness, into the swamps, and have conquered and civilized nature until she grew fair and rich and populous under the reign of man? George found it difficult to understand why the southern states would secede from the Union and act so harmful to their interests. They didn't seem to have thought through the disruptions of war, how much it would cost, how difficult it would be to maintain a position nearly as strong as an independent country as they enjoyed in the Union. But in the end, cool-headedness wasn't a characteristic of Southerners. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, Southern leaders refused to accept the election results and began to lead their states into secession. George wasn't the least surprised. He was much interested in what Lincoln would say at his inauguration. The ceremony was attended by 30,000 people. While the speech had gotten mixed reviews in America, George reported that it was just the kind of speech he expected, that Lincoln wouldn't agree that states had a right to leave the Union once they had joined it. However, George noted that Lincoln had promised that he would take no action against the South as long as they didn't attack first. Lincoln pointed out that the president had limited powers. In your hands, dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not mine, is the momentous question of civil war. George concluded his editorial with Lincoln's words, which he much admired. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot's grave to every living heart and hearthstone over this broad land yet will swell the course of union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." George didn't think that England would ever accept the independence of the Confederacy because of the support of slavery. To promote this opinion, George quoted from a speech by the new Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. He claimed that America was founded on the principle that slavery was wrong. Our new government is on exactly the opposite side. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. Thus, our new government is the first in the history of the world based on this great physical and moral truth. Like much of England, Ireland, and Europe, George was watching and waiting anxiously for each new dispatch. A month later, the fighting actually began with the firing by the Charleston guns on Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor. The first battle was one in which Mitchell's oldest son, John, participated. The younger Mitchell was charged with the targeting of the cannons. His skill helped produce significant damage to the fort. This would be a time of great challenge for the new president as George saw the situation. There were two ways for Lincoln to move forward. Either he could appeal to Congress for legislation that would give him extraordinary powers, or he would have to assert that he already possessed the powers he needed. George saw hopes for something positive to come from the war. Mankind, like water, becomes putrid by stagnation. The nature of man not being pure enough for undisturbed repose, it requires tempests and hurricanes to cleanse it thoroughly. The mask of his hypocrisy is torn off a whole nation or race or community, and in one moment is revealed to a whole people what its morality, what its piety is worth. News of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war, arrived in Newry in time for George to write an editorial, spreading the news in his paper of August 6th. He had no spin on the results to offer. He called the battle a total rout of the North. They had dropped much equipment before running away from the fighting. England looked at the results of the events in America and saw the American system failing. While Americans proudly proclaimed a high status among nations, the action of their troops at Bull Run should teach them that modesty is required. When compared to the British Army and their record of historic victories on many battlefields, the United States cuts a very sorry figure. George had been confident early on that slavery was at the heart of American disintegration. But by harvest time, 1861, he wasn't quite so sure. The English government had begun to make claims that the war was an effort to regain the government facilities in states that were now part of the Confederacy, rather than a struggle to end slavery. England had rejected slavery, but had managed to end it in its Caribbean colonies without going to war over the issue. They had bought the slaves from the owners, like buying any other form of property. Then they established the newly freed Negroes would be apprenticed to their former owners long enough to learn a trade and provide a good transition. To the English, this approach was much preferable to fighting a war. Rather than focus on a rising threat of rebellion in Ireland, George was more attentive to the rebellion raging 3,000 miles away. He was particularly interested in one incident, the Trent Affair. Ever heard of the Trent Affair? Which threatened to entangle England in war. A northern ship enforcing the British flag, which flew the British flag, was intercepted by northern ships. They found two men who were emissaries from the Confederacy on their way to England and France to plead for recognition of the South by both countries. Instead of enjoying safe passage, the two men, Slidell and Mason, found themselves seized at gunpoint and taken off the Trent. The English government was outraged. They immediately dispatched an ultimatum to President Lincoln demanding an apology, reparations, immediate release of the diplomats, and their transportation to England at American expense. The Union faced a self-inflicted danger that their armies might soon be fighting the British and the Confederacy at the same time. Days passed without any response from President Lincoln. George suspected that President Lincoln would offer an apology to the British government, but not release the prisoners. A few days later, George provided his readers with another theory. President Lincoln would release the prisoners, an act that would so enrage his northern supporters that they would force him to resign. The British government wasn't content to wait for a response to his ultimatum. They began to transport troops to Canada to provide a military force ready for action near the northern border. The British regiment currently stationed in Newry was among the troops sent to Canada. England assumed a war footing. Only on the last day of the year did the British learn the reason for Lincoln's silence. The ship carrying the ultimatum had been delayed during the Atlantic crossing and had only recently reached Washington. George wrote in his New Year's editorial that word of war was expected momentarily. In the next edition of the Telegraph, George was relieved to report that President Lincoln intended to resolve the issue peacefully, that Mason and Slidell had been released and would soon reach England. So it was time for a bit of crowing. He called the American government and President Lincoln vaporing beggars who had gone down on their knees. Then he called their actions, which George had demanded of them, a craven-spirited surrender at the last minute before the giant strength of Old England. As month went by, with news of one inconclusive battle after another reaching Neary, George began to believe that the South might actually be able to gain independence. He could see no other outcome than permanent separation. He hoped that this result would happen soon, in part to end the suffering of cotton weavers in England and Ireland, whose cotton supplies had been disrupted. During the summer of 1862, George had hinted he was changing his mind about the American Civil War. As summer ended, he told his readers that he had indeed changed his opinion and explained why. He now believed the time had come for the British and French governments to recognize the independence of the South. The people of the South had proven themselves to be very brave and skilled fighters, thus fulfilling one of the major international principles for recognition as a nation. They had proven they could defend themselves against a better equipped northern forces. George also felt that Britain had been badly treated by the North. They had barred British ships from waters they had always sailed freely. They had boarded British ships, requiring captains to sign documents that guaranteed that goods they were carrying wouldn't fall into Southern hands. Also painful were increased tariffs designed to keep British products out of America. George was sure that the only reason that Britain refused to recognize the South as an independent country was the issue of slavery. George now argued that this issue shouldn't prevent recognition of the Confederacy. He believed blacks in the North were little better off than when they had been slaves in the South. President Lincoln himself showed little sympathy for the black slaves, supporting the deportation of freed blacks, and he clearly wasn't willing to free the slaves held in the South. Now, George had a rather unusual argument to complete the case he was making. If supporters of the Union were really concerned about slavery, they should accept the independent Confederacy now. Slavery would most likely end under an independent South. Planters would gradually come to see they would be more successful having free labor grow their cotton than slaves. One by one, they would free their own slaves. Slaves would be better off if the war ended now, with the South relatively undamaged, than if they were forced by a prolonged war to live with their former masters in a southern wasteland. The Lincoln who was executing the terrible war was quite different from the leader that most people had admired when he was elected and given his first major speech. It turned out that President Lincoln had become an absolute monarch. Fewer and fewer recruits were willing to fight for such a person and such a failing cause. They had begun to accept the fact that the Confederacy was going to win. A free people whose territory is invaded, whose liberties are threatened, whose honor is outraged, and whose houses are desolated, can never lay down their arms. The North was fighting for empire, not freedom. Given these faults, George believed the conflict should be quickly ended through foreign intervention. Shortly after George expressed his new views on the war, the Great Battle of Antietam took place, followed quickly by the emancipation to free the slaves. George had been writing about this option for some months. He was less than impressed when it happened. He didn't think Antietam was a very large battle and hadn't changed the situation enough to provide justification for Lincoln's actions. At this point in the war, the proclamation didn't mean anything. George wasn't convinced that Lincoln wouldn't consent to a continuation of slavery, despite the proclamation, if the South would rejoin the Union. He didn't think the British government would find it of value either. With the South essentially independent, his words would have no effect there, beyond giving the South more incentive to fight. George no longer believed that such a high cost in money and lives would produce any result worth the sacrifice. Certainly the North would soon see the folly of continuing the war and agree to end it. The Irish would be very happy to see the two sections of America go their separate ways. There was sufficient territory on the continent to accommodate two separate countries. Finally, George had concluded that slaves wouldn't suffer too much by continuing to be slaves. Easy for him to say. Just let the war end. John would hardly agree with George on this issue and support his new thinking. The first reports of the Great Battle of Gettysburg arrived in Erie on Friday, July 17th. Early optimistic dispatches reported that Lee and his army were sweeping into Northern Territory unopposed by Union opposition. This belief colored the first reports of an actual resistance to Lee's advance by any federal troops. It was too early to establish the winner, but it was clear that Lee's advance had indeed been engaged, despite George's confidence that no Union army could be found to fight him. However, George must have been concerned that his opinion might not be justified when more information arrived. Before the battle began, he had believed this fighting would teach Lincoln and his fellow idiots a lesson they would not forget. The president's conduct is just as one would expect from an egotistical and fanatical person who understands as much about the duties and responsibilities of his position as an insect does of the laws of nature which regulate its periodic changes. 3 days later, George reported he had been wrong. Vicksburg had fallen, and on the same day the Union forces had defeated Lee at Gettysburg. He couldn't understand why General Lee would order a charge over an open field and up a sloping ground, at the top of which waited a well-fortified and armed army. Why Lee had forgotten the lessons of the Battle of Fredericksburg puzzled him greatly. By August, George had to report that General Meade, the victor at Gettysburg, had achieved the unthinkable. He had moved his army across the Potomac and was now operating in Confederate territory. The summer military actions had made any intervention by England and France unlikely. The war and the slaughter of soldiers of both armies, many of them sons of Ireland, would likely continue, the ending beyond view. The people of Newry were beginning to write letters to George asking why they should be interested in a war being fought so far away. George responded to those complaints in another editorial. He was concerned that thousands of Irish nationalist supporters would become skilled fighters, ready to return to Ireland to fight for Irish independence. In addition, this war gave English military leaders an opportunity to observe evolving tactics and leadership without any losses or costs to themselves. New weapons developed by American designers could be studied, and the best ones quickly adapted on this side of the ocean. There were two new inventions of particular interest in England. The Union industrialists had developed a high-powered cannon that had longer range and enough power to destroy masonry fortifications. Both sides had produced ironclad warships. Following some mysterious negotiations in 1862, the English government had agreed to build two of these new ships on the Mersey. The buyer remained a mystery, but was suspected to be an emissary from the Confederacy. Technicians appeared to share the American designs and teach English shipbuilders how to build the new kind of warship. This deal violated English neutrality, but this was a small matter compared to the need to have the British Army at the forefront of nautical innovation. When the ironclads were finished, the British government simply kept them. Up to this point, John had been worrying about the war in private. His public efforts were focused on his plan to create a new Irish organization to fight for Irish independence. However, his silence ended with word that Mitchell's youngest son, Billy, had died during Pickett's charge on the third day of the Great Battle in Gettysburg. John wrote, "The gallant boy was killed on the field. I think I told you before of the manner of his death, how the color sergeant beside him was shot down in the dreadful last charge upon the Yankee positions, and how Billy snatched up the banner from the falling hand and bore it in the death storm of shot and shell, till he in turn was struck down. A noble death, and like the boy and his blood." At this point, John broke his silence and began corresponding with the new editor of The Irishman, John's longtime friend, P.J. Smith. On November 21st, John wrote, "If all people of Ireland were of one mind upon the question of the justice of the war which the United States are waging against the Confederate States, it might be needless to discuss before them the policy of that war and its bearings upon the national interests of Ireland. If this war were unjust, as John believed it was, it would be wrong to support it just because it would have a positive result for Ireland, training the troops for Irish independence." So John was puzzled as to why his friends would think that it was proper to force a union that the South did not want. "I desire the separation because the people of the Confederate States think proper to separate, because the restoration of the Union is impossible, except by means utterly destructive of the freedom of America, because the subjugation of the South and the maintenance of federal authority over the conquered provinces would be ruinous to the prosperity and power of all America and bad for Ireland." Now the situation had changed greatly. The only way the North could win was by killing Confederate soldiers and laying waste to their cities and homes. John concluded with a grim thought. "If they succeed, farewell to freedom in America. It will be a lamentable victory." What insane lust for power is it that says territories twice as large as the rest of Europe without Russia must in America belong to one government only? And if Canada should join the North and Mexico the South, they would still be two very large countries. Editor Smith responded with a challenge for John. "Mr. Martin as yet has not ever attended to slavery, though he must be aware that the object of secession was to establish an empire whose cornerstone would be slavery, and that if it were not for slavery, there would have been no secession. To attempt to discuss the American question without referring to slavery is to enact the play of Hamlet with the part of Hamlet left out." John tried to discuss the issue again in early December. "I am conscious that my arguments can have no influence whatever upon the war and none upon the circumstances which makes Ireland a great recruiting ground for the Washington government." He agreed that the Constitution favored human freedom, dignity, and prosperity. He also conceded there would be negatives if the Union remained divided. But it was the Union that has suspended the freedoms of the Constitution to fight the war, not the South. "The war is for subjugation or for revenge, but certainly not for the Union." He restated his argument that a peaceful separation would have been the best solution. Had that happened, all the wondrous resources of America would have remained intact and in their full vigor. Each part would have become equal to the original. For the first time, John also mentioned the topic of slavery, denying that slavery had any part in secession. Cato, in The Irishman, challenges me to discuss the question of Negro slavery as a portion of the question of the war. It is not a portion of the question of the war. All the world knows the war is not made for the object of freeing the slaves, but solely to establish the government over all the states. More devastating news arrived in Newry. in July 1864. John was notified that Mitchell's oldest son, John, had died on the ramparts of Fort Sumter. The death of this young man, so much like the son John might have had, was particularly crushing. While John mourned, George seemed more hopeful that a negotiated settlement might soon end the war. The Confederates had already reached out to President Lincoln for terms. Lincoln would only accept return to the Union and freedom from the slaves. George worried that any opportunity for peace, if wasted, might not return again. It has turned up once more, perhaps for the last time, and Mr. Lincoln is too stupid or too stubborn to embrace it. George once again declared that he wasn't in favor of slavery, but we cannot see that we would be justified in employing force to accomplish our desire, or that to set a Negro free to enslave the white man could be regarded as an improvement. With all our enmity to slavery, we must not forget that the white man could not do the duty assigned to the Negro. In another editorial, he assigned to the South the determination he always ascribed to the Protestants of Ulster. The South will perish before submitting, and the question for humanity will be, is the price too high for conquest on one hand and independence on the other? In early September 1864, John wrote another letter to Smith in The Irishman. In it, he launched a savage attack on the people of New England, unlike anything he had put in writing before. I say that the English and New Englanders are the two people likest to each other in all the world. They have similar virtues and similar vices, similar characters, similar objects in life. In fact, they are the same blood and race, and they differ only in age and in circumstance. To make money, to make it for the sake of making it, to enjoy it mainly in displaying the possession of it, or in feeling the consciousness of possessing it, is the summum bonum of the New Englander, just as it is of the Englishman. To admire grand principles of morality and fine sensibilities, but not to suffer them to interfere with their own interest, or pride, or ambition. To be draconian judges of the crimes of others and commit the very same crimes themselves. To love and vindicate freedom for themselves, but not to allow freedom to their neighbors, if they can help it. To hate their rivals, scorn their inferiors, trample on those who are down, to have clamorous sympathy for the questionable wrongs of Negroes, other people's Negroes, any wrongs the righting of which will cost them nothing. This is English character and New England character. Smith continued to make his arguments with John very clear. The southern part of America had no justifiable reason to revolt. The leaders of the South avowed that the government against which they rose was the most beneficent that ever existed on earth. Every state in the South, as every state in the North, enjoyed under the Constitution of the United States plenary powers of self-government. Each regulated uncontrolled its domestic affairs, and each was protected against foreign aggression or violence by the all-embracing arm of the Union. Not only was freedom guaranteed in all parts of the country, the South had special benefits bestowed on it by the Constitution. Voters in the South had a proportionately greater influence in Congress than the North. So throughout that whole period, Southern influence was supreme in the councils of the national government. It was the Vice President of the Confederacy, Mr. Stevens, who had made clear that slavery was the sole cause for secession. The Southern states had participated freely in the election of 1860. So they had guaranteed that it would abide by that election. Had its own candidate been returned, all would have been well. There would have been no secession, no war. It had not been denied that Mr. Lincoln was constitutionally elected, yet the South made his election the pretext for revolt, thus striking at the root of all free governments, which is the minority shall bow to the constitutionally declared rule of the majority. Mr. Lincoln's election was the pretext, but the object was the erection upon the ruins of the Republic of Washington of an empire whose cornerstone would be slavery. The ruling power in America is the ballot box, and the character of the administration is determined by popular vote, not of East nor West, but the whole nation. Then Smith moved on to strongly support the people of New England. The Northeast have shown how tyranny may be resisted, freedom won, the foundations of national prosperity laid, and the flag of civilization advanced to the furthest confines of the desert. Brand them as criminals if you choose, but rest assured that the people who have given to liberty and humanity a Benjamin Franklin, to poetry a Longfellow, to eloquence a Daniel Webster, a people who can count among their monuments a Bunker Hill. Rest assured that such people will survive the assault even of an Irish patriot. But what is their great crime? To have clamorous sympathies for the questionable wrongs of Negroes, other people's Negroes? Finally, Smith took John to task for supporting slavery. Here at last, then, you openly identify yourself with slavery, slavery in the abstract and in the concrete. It were impossible for you to avoid it, for you are too honest a man to shrink from all or any of the illogical conclusions which a support for the Southern Confederacy involves. The man who supports the Southern cause and pretends at the same time to condemn slavery is a knave, a hypocrite, and an impostor. You, like a truthful man as you are, while upholding the South, shrink not from upholding the institution in the interests of which the South rebelled. Questionable wrongs of Negroes, they admit of no question. They are written in characters of blood. They may be traced in the fair skin and handsome figures of the quadroon, as plainly as in the mutilated members, the branded back and brow and arm of the full-blooded African. The Virginia wilderness, the New Orleans auction block, all testify against the atrocity of the institution which has degraded the black man below the level of brute and caused the white man to become a rebel when he ceased to be a ruler. This letter has caused me much pain. Your devoted friend I shall ever be, but on this subject there is a gulf between us, which, I fear, can never be bridged. John attempted to explain his position on slavery in his response. For my own part, I don't condemn Negro slavery, neither do I advocate for it. He had studied the issue thoroughly for a long time. The weight of the argument seems to be upon the side of those who advocated slavery, but my instincts are still on the side of abolition. This was the last time John mentioned slavery publicly. Meanwhile, a presidential election was taking place in America. News of the outcome reached Newry on November 22nd, 1864. George had hoped that General McClellan would defeat the sitting president and bring the terrible carnage in America to an end. He wrote an editorial on the subject 4 days later, in which he had critiques for both Lincoln and Davis. To George, Lincoln was a vain old man. In his election speech, Lincoln had reaffirmed his intention to reunify the country. Though there were problems facing Southern armies, Davis refused to acknowledge reality. He would not free the slaves, and he would fight on until the South was either destroyed or free. So George returned to his initial assessment about the cause for the war. Slavery caused the sword to be drawn. Slavery terminated the conference, and slavery must be abolished before peace can be announced. John wrote one last letter about the Civil War on March 18th, 1865, which was published in The Nation 3 days later. He stated that he had seen nothing in the situation in America to change his mind about the war since his discussion of slavery. He had never believed that England would intervene to stop the war, but he had always held hopes that the French government would. Such friendly intervention would have saved the citizens of the South from becoming subjects and the citizens of the North from becoming oppressors, would have secured their homes and their freedom to all citizens of the states, would have preserved to them and told the world that glorious free constitution, of which only the dead form will remain if the armies and fleets of the North accomplish the subjugation of the Southern people. As to England, I never dreamed of her lifting a finger to save the blood of American citizens or doing anything in the quarrel except to make money out of it. John had grown very depressed about the outcome of the conflict. The northern invaders have yet many thousands more of brave men to kill before they can take quick possession. And when at length the country of the Confederacy becomes a conquered province, if such be the will of God, if the widows and orphans of its gallant defenders lie helpless at the feet of the conquerors, history will have to tell of another national struggle against subjugation, which for patriotic union of all classes and for heroes' deeds and sufferings of men and women and boys has never been surpassed and has scarcely ever been equaled. John then returned to his beginning statement that nothing had happened to change his view of the war. Nothing has been alleged which justifies the attempt of the Northerns to replace the old free union with a union of force, the union of hearts with a union of chains. Of all that I have written on the quarrel, I have nothing to retract. I have always written as a friend of both Northern and Southern. Well, maybe not. John concluded his letter with final judgment. If the Northerns accomplish the conquest of the South, they will have committed, in my judgment, a great national crime and also a great national folly. Certainly, they may become a grand and terrible nation of conquerors and may plant their eagle and their stripes and stars in triumph over many a desolated county, over the bones of myriads of slaughtered patriots. But is that good? No. By the conquest of the South, they will merely gain territory and subjects, and will be obliged henceforth to employ the means of which subjects are kept in obedience, and subject countries are debased and plundered. That all comes from his experience in Ireland, being subject to England. Just a few days after John's final letter, George announced the meeting of Generals Lee and Grant at the small brick courthouse in Appomattox, at the small brick house at Appomattox Courthouse, during which General Lee surrendered his army. The Civil War was over. But John had incorrectly predicted what would happen next. The defeated Confederate soldiers were allowed to keep their guns and swords and return peacefully to their homes. They marched away between lines of Union soldiers, standing at attention and saluting their opponents. Less than a week later, telegraphs brought the stunning news to the telegraph office that President Lincoln had been assassinated. George wrote an obituary for the murdered leader. He felt the murder was especially sad, coming so soon after Lincoln had achieved victory in the war. George now referred to the man he had once called a tyrant and an idiot in a different, somewhat less harsh light. The late president was not a man of brilliant genius. He had no claim to literary fame. Still, history will record to his merit that he guided the helm with sagacity and rode out the storm more successfully than many wise men amongst us had imagined. He guided it with great sacrifice of human life and at great cost to the owner of the vessel. Still, he guided it so far safely, and the haven for which he sailed was in sight, when a coward arrested his progress to increased fame. The American Civil War had ended. The Irish Civil War lay ahead. So, anybody have any questions? Yes.
No, I just had a question. I mean, just some of the language behind it and being oppression and everything. It just, I know from that mentality back then, just like not completely blind to, black people being the people and everything, but he came from the oppression over in Ireland.
Excuse me.
He came from the oppression over in Ireland,
Yep.
yet he wasn't seeing them as people. And that, I mean, I know they don't address that because, they were white men in the 1800s, so they're just racist, period. So,
So you're referring to John Martin.
John, is it Smith?
Mitchell?
Mitchell? Yeah, the father of the two sons that were
Yes.
killed. But just the oppression, but I also know that the propaganda around the Confederates, the people that fought for the Confederacy, the propaganda around it was really not about slavery. It was really about the wealth and the rich and the poor. But there is things about the rich and the poor even to this day in the United States that's not being completely addressed. But it was about slavery, and it was about other things as well. But mostly it was about slavery. And history books, depending on when it was written in the United States, will say, "Oh no, it was about the rich in the Northeast and the poor in the South." And they were extremely wealthy. They wanted to hold on to their wealth, so it had nothing to do with that rhetoric.
It was interesting. John Mitchell was a very interesting character because he and John Martin had been very active politically in Ireland. And at the time, in the 1840s, there was a revolt conducted by a group, young islanders. John Mitchell and John Martin were both part of that. They were both arrested, tried, convicted by the British government, and sent off to Australia to exile. So that had sort of colored their point of view. John Martin served out his time. John Mitchell escaped. P.J. Smith, the editor, helped him escape and come to America. And he found himself more comfortable with the society of the South. Though he did admit at the end that if he had been wrong about what Negroes could do, it was the worst crime against humanity ever. Another interesting thing was that John Martin was always worried about what would happen to his family because at the time at the end of the war, John Mitchell was in Richmond, which is not a terribly healthy place to be because the Union armies were coming. And so as the Union armies approached, John Mitchell and his only surviving son, James, who lost an arm at Fredericksburg, they left Richmond and went south. So here's his wife, Jenny, stuck in their house in Richmond, waiting for these people who were going to come through and ravage and pillage everything. The Confederates set most of Richmond on fire, just like they had in the Atlantic for those who watched Violent Wind. And the fire came right up to the Mitchell's house, but it stopped. And so the Union troops came in. The general in charge had everything under control. There was no looting, no pillaging, no raping, nothing. And in fact, Jenny, Mitchell's wife, went to Union headquarters and asked that the Union Army come guard their house. And so there was a round-the-clock Union Army guarding the Mitchell's house. So John was way out in left field and changed his positions, but that's the way it was. Anyway, if you're interested, there's my Memorial Day special on the books. The new book I'll sell for $20. On the first book, which I recommend you read first, it's free. Because we have a new edition of it that's just now out. The books are always available on Amazon. and I'll just share with you, because this blew me away, a review by an Irish lawyer and a student of Irish history. So this is the Irish perspective on this book. Marjorie Harshaw Robie's new book, Dueling Dragons, The Struggle for Ireland, 1849 to 1875, is the most detailed and interesting study of Ireland and Newry ever written, and unlikely ever to be equaled. The sequel to the author's first book, Dwelling Place of Dragons, this praise is deserved because Marjorie takes us deep down into the engine room of Ireland's history, where we can observe the cogs and wheels of its moving parts. She shows us that to understand this small island, it is critical that we study the roles played by its landed, capitalist, and laboring classes. The review ended this way: Dueling Dragons should be noted as the greatest book ever written about Irish history, and it should become very famous as future historians come to read it. And again, most of this was written not by me, but by the people that I quoted for you today. So, thank you for coming and listening and welcoming me back to sort of familiar territory. Yes?
What was the delay between, say, you mentioned different battles and the news getting to Ireland? What was the time delay?
Well, they actually had a telegraph that functioned. And I'm not quite sure why the English message didn't go by telegraph, but the telegraph had been laid already. So by the end of the war, they were getting telegraph messages. Yeah.
I also find it fascinating because Newry is the stronghold for the IRA, or was the stronghold for the IRA. That area is the IRA territory.
Yeah.
So,
This is,
when did you visit?
I've been there
Every year.
dozens of times.
Yeah.
It's my one extravagance, but
Yeah.
yes, this is where the Civil War happened, because this is where you had a large number of Protestants living amongst the Catholic population, and the Protestants didn't want anything to change, and of course the Catholic majority, 75% of the Irish people are Catholic and wanted independence. And so it was this 25%, mostly in the northern and eastern area, that wanted to keep things as they were. So this is where the fighting happened, but it happened all over. Two of James Harshaw was the only one of the three men who have descendants. So there's nobody to remember them. And the sad part is I do have a picture of John and James, but I do not have a picture of George. I've been in contact with other branches of his family that don't have any of that. But, so anyway, James Harshaw had a large family. Some of them came to America, live in America now. Some of them I'm still hunting for and haven't been able to find because the last name is Smith. It should have hung on to Harshaw. But anyway, two of James Harshaw's descendants were killed in the Troubles. One of them was accidentally killed in Newry in an IRA bombing. Marjorie Harshaw, who was 19. And the other one was an IRA assassination. His great-great-grandson was an MP. He was the only member of Parliament that was actually assassinated during the Troubles, and the IRA just went into his office and shot him. There was another very serious attack in Donegal. If James had been alive and John had been alive and living there, they would have heard it. It was the Miami Show Band massacre. And the Miami Show Band was a band from the Irish Republic and had been performing locally. And the show bands were the only way that Protestants and Catholics were getting together during the war. They would come together, both sides, and dance to these bands. So on the way home in their van, the van was stopped at a roadblock. Well, there were always roadblocks, and you would encounter them. You'd be driving down a little road, and all of a sudden there's a roadblock there where there'd never been one before. And I went there early enough to experience some of that. What looked like an army stop, guys had uniforms, ordered the band members to get out. The band members got out, thinking it was just a routine stop. A couple of the guys went around to the back of the van, and all of a sudden there was this huge explosion because what they were doing was planting a bomb, which they wanted to go off later on. This was a Protestant organization that was doing this, and there was a British officer there on site. So as soon as the bomb went off and the two people who held it were killed, then the rest of the soldiers just started shooting the band members just standing there as they tried to dive for cover. And everybody in the area knew about it. And one of the survivors of the band is now part of a group that's trying to bring reconciliation to Northern Ireland, rather like they did in South Africa after apartheid. And he's teamed up with another man that I met when I did the book launch in Newry. I met this very nice man named Eugene, I forgot his last name. But he was also impacted because an IRA, same gang of people that carried out the Miami show band did this hit job. They came to his house on Sunday afternoon, when ordinarily all the family would be there. Fortunately for the family, I guess, only 3 of his brothers were there at the time, so they came in and they murdered the 3 brothers. And so he's teamed up with a man from the survivor of the Miami show band, and they're now leading the effort to provide reconciliation. But it's still a big issue, you know. It can just flare up there at any time. I mean, recently there was just a murder there of a young reporter in Derry.
Yeah.
So, and of course Brexit isn't helping me if you're following that.
Yeah.
Brexit, the people of this area were not in favor of Brexit because they were worried about the border. The first time the hard border, you picture this small island the size of Maine, and there's a line across it. And there was a border, so when you went into the north from the Republic, you went through a checkpoint. There was in Newry there was a big cage, and you drove through the cage. There was a big military complex on the top. And so we did that on that first trip I made to Ireland in 1992. And it was stunning to me because I'm not used to being in war zone, to be truthful. And you see ordinary, look like police sort of, but on the other side there were British soldiers in full camouflage with their big guns. It was not comforting to me.
My friend is from Newry, and they moved to Chicago for 3 years because the troubles were so bad in the 70s. So for 3 years, like the British actually held a gun to his head when he was a kid in a car. And they were very intimidating to the locals there. And also hearing, like his mom was a nurse, and they would regularly open her car up and take all her stuff out and make her late for her shift deliberately. And so the soldiers did that. So it was pretty intense. And,
It's an amazing situation and caused by things that should be relatively easily resolvable. if you think about it, schools in Northern Ireland are segregated, most of them anyway. Catholics go to one school, Protestants go to another. Both of them are funded like our public schools. So you tend not to know too many people of the other religious faith. It's a very sad, tragic situation. It's been lingering for years and years and years. The other funny thing is that John Martin, after he came back from his exile and so forth, he was actually elected a member of Parliament. So when he died, he was a member of the British Parliament. And he figured his job was to go over there, not to convince the English because he didn't think that was possible, but go over and explain to them what the Irish thought. And even though he was a Protestant, he was always in favor of Irish independence and held no religious animosity to Catholics at all. Many of he maintained friends on both sides of the aisle. So anyway, John Martin is buried in the cemetery in Donegal Moor. All right, and maybe as far away from me to you is buried a man named Robert Jackson, and he was the one who instituted the Miami Show Band massacre, the one that raged all over. Estimated that he killed 30 people, and he was, because of his connections to the British, he was never arrested. So here's John Martin here, and it's this terrorist in the same cemetery, very close. Very strange. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to be back in Wayland.